March 4, 1944. 29,000 feet above the German countryside, First Lieutenant James Goodson scanned the horizon through the crystal-clear canopy of his P-51 Mustang. Below him, spread across miles of cold European sky, flew over 600 B-17 flying fortresses, their contrails painting white streaks against the winter blue. The bombers were heading to a target that had become synonymous with terror for American aircrews: Berlin. Goodson had flown P-47 Thunderbolts for months, good escorts that could protect the bombers within 200 miles of England. But 200 miles meant nothing when the Reich capital lay 560 miles from base. For over a year, German fighter pilots had perfected a brutal calculus: wait. Watch the American escorts turn back as their fuel ran low, then attack the defenseless bombers with impunity. But today was different. Goodson's Mustang carried enough fuel to reach Berlin and return. The sleek fighter beneath him represented something the Luftwaffe High Command had dismissed as impossible: a single-engine fighter with combat radius exceeding 800 miles. German intelligence officers had calculated it couldn't be done. German fighter pilots had mocked the very concept. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself had declared that American fighters would never reach Germany's heartland. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They were all wrong, and within hours, that miscalculation would begin destroying the Luftwaffe more effectively than any bombing campaign ever could. The story of how German pilots came to face an enemy they'd been assured didn't exist began not in the skies over Europe, but in a British Purchasing Commission office in April 1940. The Royal Air Force desperately needed fighters. German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were devastating, RAF squadrons during the Battle of Britain. The British approached North American aviation with a request to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license, a proven fighter that could be manufactured quickly. North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, made a counter-proposal that seemed absurdly ambitious. His company could design and build an entirely new fighter in the same time it would take to set up P-40 production lines. Better still, this fighter would outperform the P-40 inches every significant category. The RAF, desperate for any aircraft, agreed. They placed an order with one condition: the prototype had to fly within 120 days. North American's design team, led by Chief Engineer Edgar Schmood, worked at a pace that bordered on reckless. They studied every fighter design they could access, analyzing what worked and what failed. They examined the P-40's cooling system and rejected it as inefficient. They reviewed German aerodynamics research on laminar flow wings, designs that reduced drag dramatically if manufactured to exacting tolerances. They investigated the Allison V1710 engine, a reliable 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plant producing over 1,000 horsepower. The design that emerged prioritized range above all else. Where most fighters packed fuel tanks into the fuselage around the engine, Schmood's team placed massive self-sealing tanks in the wings. Each wing carried 92 gallons, giving the fighter 184 gallons of internal fuel. For comparison, the Messerschmitt Bf-109G carried only 88 gallons internally. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A held about 114 gallons. Even the massive P-47 Thunderbolt started with only 305 gallons internal before later modifications. This fuel arrangement was unconventional but brilliant. It freed up fuselage space while distributing weight across the wings. The design required relocating the engine's coolant system, normally mounted in the nose. Schmood's engineers positioned it beneath the fuselage in a ventral scoop that also served as an air intake. This arrangement looked ungainly but proved remarkably efficient, cooling the glycol mixture while adding minimal drag. 117 days after receiving the contract, on October 26, 1940, the prototype NA-73X rolled out for its first flight. Test pilot Vance Breeze took it up and reported exceptional handling characteristics. The aircraft climbed rapidly, accelerated smoothly, and demonstrated surprising agility for its size. Maximum speed exceeded 370 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, faster than the P-40 and competitive with European fighters. The RAF received their first Mustang Mark Is in October 1941. British pilots found the aircraft outstanding for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack. At altitudes below 15,000 feet, the Mustang could outrun and outmaneuver anything the Luftwaffe flew. But above 15,000 feet, where bomber escort operations occurred, the Allison engine's performance degraded rapidly. The single-stage supercharger couldn't maintain power in thin air. At 25,000 feet, where American B-17 seconds typically operated, the Mustang Mark I was dangerously underpowered. This limitation relegated the Mustang to secondary roles. Army Cooperation Command used them for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack against German positions in France. They performed brilliantly in these missions, but they couldn't do the one job the Allies desperately needed. Escort, heavy bombers, deep into Germany. Meanwhile, the strategic bombing campaign was approaching catastrophe. In August 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a massive double strike against German industrial targets at Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The plan was ambitious. 376 B-17 flying fortresses would attack ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Messerschmitt aircraft plants at Regensburg. Fighter escorts would accompany the bombers as far as their fuel allowed. Then the B-17 seconds would continue alone, relying on their defensive armament to survive. American doctrine held that massed bomber formations could defend themselves through concentrated firepower. Each B-17 carried 1350 caliber machine guns. Formations of 200 bombers presented a defensive wall of over 2,600 machine guns. Surely, planners reasoned, no fighter force could penetrate such firepower. The mission departed England on August 17th. British Spitfires escorted the bombers across the English Channel. P-47 Thunderbolts took over and pushed as far as the German border before fuel forced them to turn back. Then the bombers continued alone into German airspace. Luftwaffe fighter controllers tracked the formation carefully. They positioned hundreds of fighters along the bomber route, holding them on the ground until the escorts departed. Then they struck. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf FW 190 seconds attacked from every angle. They came in waves, making high-speed passes through the bomber formations, firing cannon and machine guns, then breaking away to rearm and attack again. The formations heading to Regensburg lost 24 bombers. The Schweinfurt force lost 36. Another 11 returned so heavily damaged they were scrapped. 162 bombers suffered battle damage. 552 crewmen were killed or captured. The Americans claimed to have shot down over 200 German fighters. Actual German losses were 25 to 27 aircraft. The targets suffered damage but recovered quickly. German engineers dragged machinery from damaged buildings and had production lines operating within weeks. Ball-bearing stockpiles made up shortfalls. By September, production exceeded August levels. The Americans had traded 60 bombers and over 500 trained aircrew for temporary disruption that Germany absorbed with minimal difficulty. Senior commanders recognized the implications immediately. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, knew his force couldn't sustain such losses. But bombing advocates in Washington demanded results. The pressure to prove daylight strategic bombing could work was immense. Perhaps one more mission, properly executed, would demonstrate the concept's validity. On October 14, 1943, 291 B-17 seconds departed England for Schweinfurt. This time, the entire force targeted the ball-bearing plants. Additional P-47 escorts were assigned. Planners implemented lessons learned from August. Everything was optimized for success. The mission became known as Black Thursday. German fighters waited until escorts turned back, then attacked with coordinated ferocity. They came in large formations, sometimes 30 or 40 fighters at once, overwhelming defensive fire through sheer numbers. Heavy bombers fell from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. Parachutes blossomed as crews bailed out. Some bombers simply exploded when cannon shells hit fuel tanks or bomb loads. 60 bombers were shot down. 17 more were so heavily damaged they never flew again. 121 returned with moderate to severe battle damage. 650 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured out of 2,900 who flew the mission. Loss rates exceeded 20%. No military organization could sustain such attrition. The 8th Air Force official history acknowledged the reality bluntly. The fact was that the 8th Air Force had, for the time being, lost air superiority over Germany. Deep penetration raids were suspended. For 5 months, American heavy bombers would limit operations to targets within escort range. The fundamental problem was physics. Existing escort fighters lacked the range to protect the bombers over Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a formidable fighter, heavily armed and exceptionally durable, but its massive radial engine consumed fuel voraciously. Even with external drop tanks, combat radius barely exceeded 400 miles. The P-38 Lightning had the range theoretically, but both engines used troublesome turbo superchargers that proved unreliable in European conditions. The aircraft was also in short supply, with most production going to the Pacific Theatre, where twin engines were considered essential for overwater operations. British and American intelligence officers studied the problem obsessively. They calculated fuel consumption rates, engine efficiencies, aerodynamic drag coefficients, and operational requirements. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. No existing single-engine fighter could escort bombers to Berlin and back. The distances were simply too great. German intelligence reached identical conclusions. Luftwaffe technical staff analyzed captured American fighters systematically. They measured fuel tank capacities, tested engine consumption rates, and calculated maximum range with drop tanks. The mathematics were unforgiving. Single-engine fighters would always be range-limited compared to bombers because fighters needed high-power settings for combat maneuvers, while bombers cruised at economical throttle settings. Luftwaffe fighter tactics evolved around this certainty. Let the escorts come, wait for them to leave, then attack. It was brutally effective and seemingly undefeatable. American fighters might achieve local air superiority, but only temporarily. German fighters controlled German airspace because physics guaranteed they would always get the last word. This confidence wasn't arrogance. It was mathematical certainty backed by captured intelligence. In late 1943, German technicians examined a damaged P-51A that force-landed in occupied France. They measured its fuel capacity carefully. 184 gallons internal. They knew the Allison engine's consumption rate from previous captures. They calculated maximum range with standard drop tanks. The numbers confirmed what they already knew. The Mustang, like every other American fighter, couldn't reach Berlin. What German intelligence didn't know was that a revolution was already underway. Not in fighter design, but in engine technology. And that revolution would invalidate every assumption the Luftwaffe had made about escort fighter impossibility. In April 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang Mark I at an RAF base. He was impressed by the aircraft's handling and performance at low altitude, but he immediately recognized the Allison engine's limitation at high altitude. Harker's instinct was simple and transformative. What if the Mustang was fitted with a Merlin engine? The Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 was one of the most sophisticated piston engines ever developed. It used a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger with an intercooler. This complex system compressed intake air twice, cooling it between stages, allowing the engine to maintain sea-level manifold pressure up to 30,000 feet. At altitudes where the Allison wheezed and struggled, the Merlin roared with full power. British engineers mated a Merlin 61 to a Mustang Mark I airframe in October 1942. The converted aircraft, designated Mustang Mark X, flew test flights that astonished everyone involved. Performance at altitude improved dramatically. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin-powered Mustang reached over 400 miles per hour, faster than any other Allied fighter at that altitude. Climb rate increased by over 40%. Combat ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet. The U.S. Army Air Forces took immediate notice. General Henry Hap Arnold ordered production of the Merlin-powered variant before flight tests even finished. In August 1942, 3 months before the prototype flew, Arnold directed North American Aviation to begin manufacturing P-51Bs with Packard-built Merlin engines. This was an extraordinary commitment based entirely on projected performance. The conversion required significant modification. The Merlin weighed over 350 pounds more than the Allison. It was taller and longer. Installing it required moving the wing forward slightly to maintain proper center of gravity. The larger engine necessitated a deeper nose profile. A 4-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller replaced the original 3-bladed unit. Production P-51Bs started rolling off North American's Inglewood, California, assembly line in June 1943. A second production line opened in Dallas shortly afterward. By late 1943, Mustangs were arriving in England in increasing numbers. The first unit to receive P-51Bs in Europe was the 354th Fighter Group, officially part of the 9th Air Force, but immediately co-opted by the 8th for bomber escort duty. On December 1, 1943, they flew their first mission, a fighter sweep over France. On December 5th, they escorted bombers to Amiens. On December 11th, they pushed to Emden. Then, on December 13th, they escorted bombers to Kiel, 480 miles into Germany. This mission was significant because it demonstrated conclusively that the P-51B could escort bombers deeper than any previous single-engine fighter. But it still wasn't enough. Berlin lay over 100 miles farther. The bombers needed escorts that could reach the Reich capital. In July 1943, the Army Air Forces issued a directive to all fighter manufacturers: maximize internal fuel capacity. North American engineers studied the P-51B's center of gravity calculations. The Merlin's additional weight had moved the center of gravity forward compared to the Allison-powered variant. This created space behind the pilot that could theoretically accommodate a fuel tank. They designed an 85-gallon self-sealing tank that fit into the fuselage aft of the cockpit. Installation required careful engineering. The tank's weight, when full, shifted the aircraft's center of gravity dangerously far aft. Stick forces per G decreased dramatically. In extreme cases, pilots could experience stick reversal during turns or snap rolls with no warning. Flight testing revealed the problem clearly. With a full fuselage tank, the P-51B handled unpredictably. Sharp maneuvers were prohibited. Combat was essentially impossible. But engineers recognized this was acceptable. Pilots could burn fuel from the rear tank first, using it during climb and cruise to the target area. By the time they reached German airspace, where combat was likely, the fuselage tank would be empty or nearly so. Normal handling would return. The solution was operational procedure, not engineering redesign. Pilots were instructed to burn the fuselage tank first, then switch to drop tanks halfway to Berlin. Over the target area, they would jettison empty drop tanks and fight on internal wing fuel only. This fuel management protocol became standard for all P-51 units. Combined with two 108-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could carry up to 489 gallons total. Wing tanks held 184 gallons. The fuselage tank added 85. Two drop tanks provided another 216. At economical cruise settings, the Merlin consumed approximately 45 gallons per hour. Simple mathematics revealed the transformation. The P-51B could remain airborne for nearly 11 hours. Combat radius, accounting for climb, cruise, combat reserves, and tactical maneuvering, exceeded 850 miles. Berlin lay 560 miles from English bases. The Mustang could escort bombers all the way to the target, engage Luftwaffe interceptors over Berlin, and return with fuel to spare. When P-51Bs fitted with fuselage tanks began arriving in England in February 1944, 8th Air Force commanders recognized immediately what they possessed. For the first time since strategic bombing began, they had a fighter that could protect bombers throughout their entire mission. The escort gap, that deadly zone where bombers flew alone, had been eliminated. The 4th Fighter Group, stationed at Debden, 40 miles north of London, received their P-51Bs on February 28, 1944. The unit was legendary, originally formed from American volunteers who had flown with the RAF Eagle squadrons. Their commander, Colonel Donald Blakesley, was an aggressive leader who had scored victories flying Spitfires before transitioning to American service. Blakesley's group had less than a day to familiarize themselves with the new fighters. Some pilots took off with less than an hour's checkout time in the aircraft. On March 4th, just 4 days after receiving their Mustangs, the 4th Fighter Group escorted B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds to Berlin. It was the first time single-engine fighters had made the 1,100-mile round trip. German radar operators watched the bomber formations approach with practiced eyes. They'd seen this pattern hundreds of times. Large bomber forces proceeding toward Germany from England, escort fighters accompanying them. The standard procedure was clear: track the bombers, monitor when escorts turned back, position interceptors for attack after the escorts departed. But on this mission, something unprecedented occurred. The escorts didn't turn back. As the bomber formations crossed into German airspace, the Mustangs stayed with them. German controllers waited for the inevitable fuel crisis that would force the American fighters to withdraw. The Mustangs remained, flying protective cover above and around the bombers. Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled from bases across northern Germany. Experienced pilots climbed toward the bomber streams, expecting to find them undefended as always. Instead, they encountered swarms of American fighters operating with complete confidence deep inside Germany. The psychological shock was immediate and profound. German pilots had been assured this was impossible. Intelligence reports stated categorically that American single-engine fighters lacked the range to operate over Berlin. Every calculation confirmed it. Yet here they were, dozens of them, attacking with aggressive tactics that suggested they had fuel reserves to spare. Major Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter commanders, reported the Mustangs' presence to Reichsmarschall Göring. According to post-war accounts, Göring initially refused to believe it. American fighters over Berlin? Impossible. Galland reportedly climbed into his own FW-190 to verify the reports personally. He encountered Mustangs and barely escaped after firing his guns forward, creating a cloud of smoke and spent shell casings that caused pursuing Mustangs to break off, mistakenly believing they were being attacked from behind. The March 4th mission was just the beginning. The following day, March 5th, P-51 seconds escorted liberators almost to Spain. On March 6th, they returned to Berlin, gunning down 17 Luftwaffe fighters that attempted to intercept the bombers. Between March 3rd and 9th, 5 massive raids targeted Berlin with Mustang escorts for each mission. The impact on German fighter effectiveness was immediate and catastrophic. Luftwaffe interceptors could no longer wait for escort fighters to depart. They had to engage while American fighters were present, fighting on the Americans' terms. Loss rates for German fighters increased dramatically. Experienced pilots, irreplaceable veterans with hundreds of hours of combat time, were being killed defending their homeland against an enemy they'd been told couldn't reach them. Göring's reported statement captured the moment's significance. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Whether he spoke these exact words immediately or reflected on them later is debatable. But the sentiment was accurate. The Mustangs' arrival over Berlin represented a fundamental shift in the air war's strategic calculus. The bomber offensive could now proceed without the artificial range limitation that had protected German industry. Every factory, every rail yard, every airfield, every strategic target across Germany was suddenly vulnerable to sustained daylight attack. And the fighters that had made this possible were flown by pilots who were learning, with each mission, how to use the Mustang's exceptional characteristics to maximum advantage. The P-51's performance envelope matched or exceeded every Luftwaffe fighter in most categories. Maximum speed at altitude exceeded 430 miles per hour. The aircraft could reach 400 miles per hour by 11,000 feet and maintain that speed all the way up to 40,000 feet. Climb rate was exceptional, reaching 20,000 feet in just under 6 minutes. Service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German production fighter. But the most important advantage wasn't raw performance, it was operational flexibility. The Mustang could cruise economically at high altitude for hours, then fight at maximum power when needed, then cruise home. German fighters had to operate from bases under constant attack, with limited fuel reserves, against an enemy that could choose when and where to engage. The tactical situation had completely reversed. For 2 years, German fighters had dictated engagement terms, waiting until escorts left before attacking defenseless bombers. Now American fighters dictated terms. They could escort bombers to any target in Germany. They could position themselves with altitude and sun advantage. They could choose to engage or not engage German interceptors based on tactical considerations. Most devastatingly, they could pursue German fighters all the way back to their bases and attack them during landing, when they were most vulnerable. General James Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944. In February, he issued a directive that changed fighter tactics fundamentally. Previously, fighters were required to stay in close formation with bombers, acting as defensive screens. Doolittle freed them from this restriction. Fighters were now ordered to pursue and destroy Luftwaffe aircraft wherever found. This aggressive new doctrine, combined with the P-51's range, created a nightmare scenario for the Luftwaffe. American fighters began sweeping ahead of bomber formations, seeking German fighters before they could assemble for coordinated attacks. They hunted along known flight paths from German bases to intercept points. They loitered over Luftwaffe airfields, strafing aircraft during takeoff and landing. During February's Big Week offensive, a concentrated series of raids against German aircraft production facilities, P-51 pilots destroyed 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. These weren't replaceable losses. Germany's pilot training program had collapsed under fuel shortages and constant Allied attacks on training bases. New pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal flight time, often less than 50 hours total. They faced American pilots with over 200 hours of training flying aircraft with decisive performance advantages. The asymmetry was unsustainable. Every experienced German pilot lost was nearly irreplaceable. Every P-51 shot down was replaced within days by another aircraft and another pilot, often with comparable or better training. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side with greater production capacity and deeper pilot reserves. America had both. The tactical revolution wasn't just about range. It was about how that range fundamentally altered every aspect of aerial combat over Germany. Luftwaffe fighter tactics since 1941 had been predicated on a simple defensive strategy: preserve aircraft and experienced pilots by engaging bombers only when they were undefended, attack in coordinated formations with overwhelming local superiority, disengage before escorts arrived or after they departed. This doctrine made strategic sense when the escort gap existed. German fighters could inflict maximum damage on bombers while minimizing their own losses. But the P-51's arrival eliminated the gap entirely, forcing German fighters to engage throughout the entire bomber mission profile. The Luftwaffe suddenly faced a choice with no acceptable options: abandon the bombers and let them destroy German industry unopposed, or attack the bombers and face American escorts with overwhelming numerical and tactical advantages. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff commanded Jagdgeschwader 77 in early 1944. He was an experienced commander with over 100 victories, someone who understood tactical realities without illusions. His memoir described the transformation bluntly. Before the Mustangs, his units could mass over target areas, attack bombers from favorable positions, and withdraw before suffering prohibitive losses. After March 1944, his fighters were intercepted during assembly, harassed during approach to bomber formations, and pursued during withdrawal. The American fighters, he noted, operated with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They didn't simply escort bombers defensively. They actively hunted German fighters, sometimes pursuing single aircraft for dozens of miles just to secure a kill. This aggressive doctrine destroyed the Luftwaffe's defensive concept completely. German pilots couldn't choose engagement terms anymore. Every mission became a battle for survival against numerically superior enemies, flying aircraft that matched or exceeded their own performance. Major Günther Rahl, another Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories, flew against Mustangs throughout 1944. He described the P-51 as technically excellent, but emphasized that its true advantage was operational. A Messerschmitt Bf 109G or Focke-Wulf FW190D could match the Mustang in specific performance categories under ideal conditions. The problem was that ideal conditions never existed. German fighters scrambled from bases under constant threat of strafing attack. They assembled in formations while watching for American fighters positioned above them. They approached bombers knowing escorts would intercept them. They fought while monitoring fuel reserves that allowed no margin for extended combat. Then they attempted to land at bases that might be under attack when they arrived. Every phase of every mission was compromised by the Mustang's presence. The P-51's cockpit provided exceptional visibility, a seemingly minor detail that proved tactically decisive. The bubble canopy introduced on the P-51D variant gave pilots unobstructed views in every direction. German fighters, particularly the Bf 109 with its narrow fuselage and framed canopy, offered restricted visibility. In combat, the pilot who saw his opponent first usually won. The Mustang pilot could spot German fighters earlier, track them more easily, and maintain visual contact during maneuvering. American pilots discovered that the P-51 excelled in specific combat regimes. At high altitudes above 25,000 ft, it was faster than any German production fighter. In dives, it could out-accelerate everything except perhaps the P-47 Thunderbolt. In zoom climbs, converting speed into altitude, it outperformed German fighters decisively because the Merlin maintained power at altitude where German engines lost effectiveness. The aircraft's weaknesses were manageable through proper tactics. Like the P-47, the P-51 couldn't sustain tight-turning combat against lighter German fighters at low speeds. But unlike the P-47, the Mustang could turn reasonably well at high speeds, where most combat actually occurred. At 350 miles per hour or above, the P-51's turn radius was competitive with German fighters. Pilots learned to maintain speed discipline, using altitude and throttle management to keep the aircraft in its performance envelope where it dominated. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group exemplified the new generation of Mustang pilots. Between March and April 1944, he claimed 21 aerial victories flying P-51Bs. His tactics were systematic and ruthlessly efficient. He positioned himself above German formations, diving through them at high speed, firing short bursts into selected targets, then zooming back to altitude. He never lingered in low-speed turning fights. He never pursued damaged aircraft into disadvantageous positions. He used the Mustang's strengths exclusively and avoided situations that exposed its limitations. Gentile's approach reflected broader tactical evolution across all P-51 units. Squadron and group commanders analyzed combat reports systematically, identifying patterns in successful and unsuccessful engagements. They developed standardized tactics that newer pilots could learn and apply. The doctrine emphasized patience over aggression, energy management over instinctive maneuvering, and situational awareness over individual kills. Fighter groups adopted formation tactics designed specifically for escort missions. A typical bomber escort formation positioned one squadron at high altitude above the bombers, acting as top cover. This squadron's mission was intercepting German fighters before they reached attack positions. A second squadron flew level with the bombers, providing immediate defense against fighters that penetrated the high cover. A third squadron, if available, swept ahead of the bomber formation, disrupting German assembly areas and attacking fighters during climb-out from their bases. This layered defense was devastatingly effective. German interceptors climbing toward bombers encountered American fighters with altitude advantage who could dive on them with impunity. If German fighters evaded the top cover and reached the bomber formations, they faced fighters flying protective weave patterns around the bombers. If they successfully attacked bombers and disengaged, they were pursued by fighters who could follow them all the way home. The fuel capacity that enabled this comprehensive escort coverage also enabled offensive operations that traumatized the Luftwaffe. P-51 groups began strafing German airfields during return flights from bomber escort missions. Pilots would escort bombers to target, engage any interceptors, then descend to low altitude and attack Luftwaffe bases on their way home. These strafing attacks were extraordinarily dangerous. German airfields bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Approaching aircraft faced walls of 20mm and 37mm fire. One hit from a large-caliber anti-aircraft shell could destroy a fighter instantly, but the attacks were also spectacularly effective. German fighters parked on airfields, often assembled in neat rows for maintenance efficiency, were helpless against 850 caliber machine guns firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. Major George Preddy, who would become the top-scoring P-51 ace in the European theatre with over 26 confirmed victories, described strafing attacks as more important strategically than air-to-air combat. Destroying a Messerschmitt on the ground achieved the same result as shooting it down in aerial combat, but with less risk and greater certainty. A damaged aircraft on an airfield might be repairable. An aircraft destroyed on the ground was permanently eliminated from German combat inventory. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Luftwaffe attempted various countermeasures against the Mustang threat. They developed new tactics emphasizing slashing attacks from high altitude, avoiding prolonged engagement. They positioned flak batteries more densely around airfields. They dispersed aircraft parking areas and improved camouflage. They experimented with jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me 262, which had performance advantages over piston-engine aircraft. None of these measures solved the fundamental problem. The Luftwaffe was fighting an attrition war against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. Even when German tactics succeeded tactically, destroying American bombers or shooting down escorts, the strategic situation continued deteriorating. American losses were replaced within days. German losses accumulated inexorably, eroding the Luftwaffe's combat capability month by month. German aircraft production actually increased through 1944 despite Allied bombing. Dispersed manufacturing, underground factories, and slave labor maintained output even as factories were destroyed. But aircraft without trained pilots were useless. Germany's pilot training program had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant training flights were curtailed severely. Allied attacks on training bases forced relocation of training units to areas farther from combat zones, reducing training effectiveness. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal experience, often less than 30 hours in the aircraft they would fly in combat. These inexperienced pilots faced American aviators with 10 times their flight experience, flying aircraft with decisive performance advantages, supported by comprehensive logistics that kept aircraft operational. The result was predictable. German pilot loss rates exceeded replacement rates. The experienced cadre that had dominated European skies in 1940 through 1942 was systematically destroyed. By late 1944, average Luftwaffe pilot experience had declined catastrophically. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, inspector of day fighters, reported in September 1944 that the average German fighter pilot had approximately 50 hours of flight time total before entering combat. Some had as little as 20 hours. These pilots were expected to engage American escorts flown by pilots with 200 to 300 hours of training. The mismatch resulted in one-sided slaughter that German commanders recognized but could not prevent. The strategic bombing campaign's effectiveness increased dramatically after P-51 seconds achieved air superiority over Germany. Bomber losses declined from unsustainable levels in late 1943 to acceptable percentages by summer 1944. The 8th Air Force could now dispatch over 1,000 bombers on single missions, with confidence that most would return. German industry faced systematic destruction. Oil refineries, which required continuous operation to produce synthetic fuel, were particularly vulnerable. Once damaged, they took months to repair. By September 1944, German fuel production had declined over 60% from January levels. This fuel crisis affected every military operation. Luftwaffe units received reduced allocations that limited training and operations. Tank divisions couldn't maneuver effectively. The German military machine, which had conquered most of Europe through mobile warfare, was increasingly paralyzed by fuel shortages that Allied bombing created and maintained. The P-51's role in achieving air superiority cannot be overstated. While P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings contributed significantly to escort operations, the Mustang's combination of range, performance, and operational economy made it uniquely effective. Production numbers reflected this assessment. North American aviation and its licensees produced over 15,000 P-51 variants during the war. At its peak, production exceeded 400 aircraft per month from multiple factories. This production volume, combined with the aircraft's reliability and maintainability, meant that 8th Air Force fighter groups could sustain intensive operations indefinitely. Aircraft lost in combat or accidents were replaced within days. Spare parts were abundant. Maintenance procedures were well documented and relatively simple. The Merlin engine, while sophisticated, was reliable and could be maintained by mechanics with standard training. German production, by contrast, faced constant disruption. Factories were bombed repeatedly. Transportation networks were destroyed, preventing efficient distribution of components. Skilled workers were drafted into military service or killed in bombing raids. Quality control declined as inexperienced workers replaced experienced craftsmen. Aircraft that did reach operational units often suffered from manufacturing defects that compromised performance and reliability. The strategic situation by mid-1944 represented complete role reversal from 3 years earlier. In 1941, the Luftwaffe had operated over Western Europe with near impunity, attacking British targets and dominating the skies through superior tactics and aircraft. By mid-1944, American and British air forces dominated German airspace so thoroughly that Luftwaffe daylight operations were nearly suicidal. This transformation occurred primarily because of one aircraft's ability to escort bombers throughout their missions. The P-51 Mustang didn't win the air war alone. Strategic bombing, numerical superiority, industrial capacity, and comprehensive logistics all contributed decisively. But the Mustang was the essential enabler that made daylight strategic bombing viable. Without it, the 8th Air Force would have continued suffering unsustainable losses that might have forced a fundamental change in Allied strategy. German recognition of the P-51's impact came slowly, filtered through denial and propaganda. Early reports of American fighters over Berlin were dismissed as impossible, then as anomalies, then finally as evidence of American material superiority that Germany couldn't match. Captured P-51 seconds were tested at Reich, the Luftwaffe's primary test facility, where German pilots confirmed the aircraft's exceptional characteristics. Test reports noted the Mustang's speed, range, handling qualities, and systems reliability. They emphasized that this was not a temporary Allied advantage, but reflected fundamental industrial and technological capabilities that Germany lacked. The Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger provided power at altitude that German engines couldn't match without adding weight and complexity that degraded reliability. The fuel capacity reflected a design philosophy that prioritized operational effectiveness over minimum weight. German test pilots who flew captured Mustangs generally offered professional assessments that acknowledged the aircraft's quality without excessive praise. They noted it was not invincible, that German fighters could defeat it under specific circumstances through superior tactics or pilot skill. But they also noted that such circumstances were increasingly rare. The typical engagement involved multiple Mustangs with altitude and energy advantage attacking German fighters already engaged with bombers or climbing from bases. These tactical disadvantages, combined with fuel shortages, numerical inferiority, and declining pilot quality, meant that individual aircraft superiority was irrelevant. Germany needed not just aircraft that could match the Mustang in dogfights, but aircraft that could be produced in comparable numbers, operated with comparable logistics, and flown by pilots with comparable training. Germany had none of these capabilities. By 1944, the Mustang's operational employment evolved throughout 1944 as tactics matured and pilot experience increased. Early missions emphasized close bomber escort, with fighters staying near the bomber formations throughout the mission. This provided maximum protection for bombers, but allowed German fighters to avoid combat by refusing to engage. The shift to offensive fighter sweeps changed this dynamic completely. Fighter groups were released to hunt Luftwaffe aircraft wherever they could be found. This aggressive doctrine forced German fighters to either engage or abandon bombers entirely. When they engaged, they faced American fighters on favorable terms. When they avoided engagement, bombers destroyed German targets unopposed. Some of the war's highest-scoring P-51 pilots achieved their victories during these offensive sweeps rather than in defensive bomber escort. Major George Preddy claimed most of his 26 victories during aggressive fighter sweeps where he hunted German aircraft systematically. Major John Meyer, of the 352nd Fighter Group, scored 24 victories using similar tactics. These pilots treated fighter operations as professional hunting, studying German tactics, identifying patterns, and exploiting weaknesses with cold efficiency. The psychological toll on Luftwaffe pilots was severe. They were fighting a defensive war against enemies who attacked with impunity whenever and wherever they chose. German pilots scrambled multiple times daily, often engaging against numerical odds of 3 or 4 to 1. They watched comrades die in combat or fail to return from missions. They landed at bases that might be strafed by American fighters within minutes. The stress was cumulative and unrelenting. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat operations finally reached their breaking point. Some requested transfers to other duties. Some continued flying but showed deteriorating performance. Some simply disappeared, shot down during missions that offered little hope of victory and no possibility of altering strategic outcomes. German ground personnel faced similar demoralization. Mechanics worked to repair aircraft that would be destroyed in combat or on the ground within days. Ground crews watched American fighters strafe their airfields with regularity, destroying aircraft, killing personnel, and creating constant fear. The psychological dominance that the Luftwaffe had enjoyed over opponents during the war's early years was now exercised against them by American and British air forces. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a hollow force. Production continued, training continued, operations continued, but effectiveness had degraded to near irrelevance. The German Air Force could no longer protect German cities from bombing, couldn't prevent Allied tactical air support of ground forces, and couldn't contest Allied air superiority over the battlefield. The strategic air war had been decisively won by the Allies, and the P-51 Mustang had been the primary instrument of that victory. The human cost of this aerial campaign was staggering on both sides. The 8th Air Force lost over 4,000 bombers and fighters during its operations over Europe. Over 47,000 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. These losses represented entire graduating classes from training programs, young men who volunteered for one of the war's most dangerous duties. German losses were even more severe. The Luftwaffe lost over 37,000 pilots killed during the war, including virtually its entire cadre of experienced pre-war and early war pilots. These were not just casualties, but represented the destruction of institutional knowledge, tactical expertise, and operational capability that could never be replaced. The Luftwaffe that existed in early 1945 bore little resemblance to the force that had dominated European skies in 1940. Individual stories illustrate the statistical realities. Hauptmann Heinz Baer scored over 200 victories during the war, making him one of Germany's highest-scoring aces. He flew against the Western Allies throughout 1944 and survived the war, a statistical anomaly given Luftwaffe pilot loss rates. His memoir describes watching the Luftwaffe's systematic destruction despite individual tactical successes. He recalled missions where his Staffel shot down multiple bombers and fighters, only to learn that overall German losses exceeded their victories. The futility was evident to experienced pilots who understood strategic realities. They could win individual battles, but were losing the war through attrition that mathematics made inevitable. Baer's survival was partly skill, partly luck, and partly because he was valuable enough as a propaganda asset that he was occasionally pulled from frontline duties for public appearances. On the American side, pilots like Chuck Yeager exemplified the new generation of fighter pilots who learned their trade in P-51 seconds over Europe. Yeager, who would later become the first pilot to break the sound barrier, scored over 11 confirmed victories flying Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group. His combat reports describe systematic hunting of German fighters using energy tactics that exploited the P-51's performance advantages. Yeager's approach was analytical rather than instinctive. He studied German tactics, identified predictable patterns, and positioned himself to exploit them. He used altitude advantage to dominate engagements, maintained speed discipline to avoid disadvantageous situations, and chose targets methodically rather than attacking opportunistically. This professional approach characterized successful P-51 pilots across all units. The contrast with Luftwaffe pilots, increasingly desperate and poorly trained, was stark. German pilots in late 1944 often attacked with more courage than skill, committing to engagements that more experienced pilots would have avoided. American pilots with hundreds of hours of training and months of combat experience easily defeated opponents with minimal training and little experience. The strategic bombing campaign that the P-51 enabled achieved results that justified the enormous costs, though historians still debate the details. German industrial production declined dramatically in late 1944 and early 1945, though separating bombing effects from other factors like raw material shortages and transportation disruption is difficult. What is certain is that the Luftwaffe's destruction as an effective force resulted directly from the air superiority campaign that P-51 seconds made possible. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest Allied air operations meaningfully. The final German offensive in the Ardennes during December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, demonstrated this reality. When weather cleared, allowing Allied air operations, German ground forces were devastated by air attacks they could not prevent. Luftwaffe attempts at ground support were futile against overwhelming Allied air superiority. The war's final months saw continued aerial combat as German pilots fought with increasing desperation. Jet fighters like the Me-262 achieved local successes, but couldn't alter strategic outcomes. German industry was shattered, fuel supplies were exhausted, transportation was paralyzed, and the Reich was collapsing under simultaneous pressure from east and west. The air war was effectively over by February 1945, though individual pilots continued fighting until Germany's surrender. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.